Okay. I have been drafted again. My friend and all of our friend, Alan Dershowitz, is of course well known, and he has been at the forefront of the fight not only for Israel's rights, but also in the fight inside the United States today and in Europe, of course, against those who undermine or want to undermine the very legitimacy of the existence of the State of Israel in whichever borders, and of course also in the fight against anti-Semitism. We are very fortunate to have Professor Alan Dershowitz, who's often in Israel, but not today, to speak to us, and I want to thank you, Alan, all the very best, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I wish I could be in Israel today, not only because it's raining and thundering in Boston, but because I love to be in Israel. And I'm here today because anytime my friend Dory Gold and my friend Danny Grossman ask me to participate in any conference, the answer is always yes. Now, I'm not a specialist in United Nations law. I'm not a specialist in international law, though I obviously teach a lot about international human rights. The reason I was invited here today is to give you some personal recollections of what surrounded the enactment of United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. First, a word of background, how I became involved in that process. I was appointed to be Justice Arthur Goldberg's law clerk during his first year on the Supreme Court to serve in his second year. And during the interview, he said to me, Mr. Dershowitz, are you prepared to take on a lifetime job? And I said, Mr. Justice, I was advised this was just a one-year job. He said, yes, it's a one-year job as my law clerk, but it's a lifetime commitment to be part of Team Goldberg, to be part of his team. At that point, I don't know what his aspirations were. He served on the Supreme Court. He went to the United Nations. He then ran for governor of New York and lost, and won. He might very well have sought higher office. And he was asking me for a commitment to remain with him and to be his assistant and to be his associate and friend all during his lifetime. It was a commitment that I satisfied and was constantly advising him and seeking advice from him till the very last day of his life. In fact, in the last week of his life, we had long conversations about the Jonathan Pollard case because he had initially taken a view against Pollard's release, and I had, I think, persuaded him to change his mind and to take some action in favor of Pollard's release. But now we go back several years after my clerkship. Justice Goldberg goes to the United Nations. I was on the phone call when there was great discussion about whether he would leave the Supreme Court. He eventually decided to go to the United Nations. Later in life, he told me, using a Yiddish word, it was basheret, that although he was not an Orthodox Jew, he was a believing Jew, and he thought perhaps it was somehow his destiny to leave the Supreme Court and be in a central position to influence the potential peace between the Israelis and the Arab world. He never perceived it as peace between Israel and the Palestinians. At that time, it was peace between the Arab world, which was in a state of belligerency, and Israel. In the weeks leading up to the 1967 war, Justice Goldberg and I were in touch repeatedly. He was also in touch with his dear friend Abe Harman. Abe Harman had been the ambassador when I was a law clerk, and Justice Goldberg would have regular Friday lunches with Ambassador Harman, to which I was often invited, and to listen to the discussions. Justice Goldberg was deeply concerned about Israel all during his life. Many of you probably know that he grew up with and was a close personal friend of Goldie Mayerson, ultimately Golda Meir. In fact, when I first made my first trip to Israel, he asked me to smuggle a carton of cigarettes to the then Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, and I had to smuggle it through security. To my everlasting regret, I didn't know how dangerous cigarettes were and how addicted Golda Meir was to American cigarettes. We now come to the 1967 war and the end of the war and the United Nations debate over how to resolve the ongoing situation. And Justice Goldberg asked me to come down to the Waldorf Astoria and spend time with him in the official apartment working on the draft of Resolution 242. I was allowed to listen in on phone conversations between Ambassador Goldberg and Laura Carradine of Great Britain, the ambassador of Great Britain to the United Nations. They were the primary drafters of Resolution 242. And there was a great conflict about that resolution. After all, a word of background, as Justice Goldberg told me at the time, it was virtually unprecedented for any nation to return militarily significant lands captured during a defensive war. This was, after all, only 22 years after the end of the Second World War, where the victorious nations seized lands from the losers. Indeed, in the situation with Germany and the Sudetenland, even expelling large numbers of people with no substantial objection from the international community or international law. Changing boundaries were thought to be required to assure peace in the future, and sacrifices were believed to have to be made by resident populations to assure that there would be no recurrence of belligerencies such as those that led to the Second World War with the Sudeten Germans and the unrealistic borders between Germany and Poland. So the whole debate started with a discussion about the unprecedented nature of asking Israel to return lands at all, but Goldberg, Carradine, Lyndon Johnson, our Secretary of State, all came to the conclusion that this was an opportunity to exchange land for peace. But it was clearly an exchange of land for peace, not simply a return of land because, as the United Nations resolution did contain a sentence that it was wrong to acquire land through warfare. That was only part of the preliminary statement. The text of the resolution itself was very clear. It required the returning of territories, we'll get to that in a minute, not all territories, not good territories, but only after peace was achieved and recognized and secure boundaries were accepted. Under the resolution, Israel was not required to return an inch of land in the absence of peace between the Arab states and Israel. It was not required to return an inch of land until such time as secure and recognized boundaries were acknowledged by all the belligerents, including Egypt and Jordan. And as everybody well recalls, shortly after the enactment of Resolution 242, which Israel immediately accepted, indeed it had indicated through the ambassador to the United Nations and the ambassador to the United States from Israel that it was willing to accept the resolution. Immediately thereafter, the Arab nations gathered at Khartoum and issued their famous 3 no's: no peace, no recognition, no negotiation. That is, they rejected Resolution 242 categorically and unequivocally, and Israel accepted it. Just a parenthetical, if one were to read the entire text of Jimmy Carter's malicious and mendacious book, recently published, you would see no reference to the fact that Israel accepted and the Arab states rejected 242. The entire thesis of Carter's benighted and erroneous book is that Israel has rejected Resolution 242 and the Arab states and the Palestinians have accepted it. The Palestinians, in addition to going to Khartoum and participating in the famous 3 no's, responded to 242 by the Palestinian Charter, which rejected Israel's right to exist, rejected any boundaries, any borders. So at that point in time, Israel was not legally obliged by international law or by United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 to return any land at all. In fact, it was Eugene Rostow, I think his name was referred to previously, who indicated that under international law there was no obligation to return any of that land, and even Secretary of State Rogers, who was not Israel's closest friend, said as follows: "We have never suggested any any withdrawal until there was a final binding written agreement that satisfied all aspects of the Security Council resolution. In other words, we have never suggested that a withdrawal occur before there was a contractual agreement entered into by the parties, signed by the parties, in each other's presence, an agreement that would provide full assurances to Israel that the Arabs would admit that Israel had a right to exist in peace. That didn't come, of course, has still not come, but it didn't come even in part until Egypt made peace with Israel, at which time Israel complied with its obligations under 242 and returned literally more than it was obliged to all of the territories. When Israel made peace with Jordan, at that point Jordan had turned over its sovereignty or its control over the territories to Palestinians. But the small amount of land that was still in dispute, that was not part of the Palestinian Authority, was immediately turned over by Israel. So, according to this interpretation, which is the authoritative interpretation of 242, Israel has never been out of compliance with 242, and the Arab states are still out of compliance with 242, though Egypt and Jordan are now in general compliance with 242, and there's been a reciprocity, there's been a land for peace. But there's been no obligation to return lands captured by from Syria, because Syria has not made a peace with Israel, and indeed, technically, really no obligation even to return lands to Egypt and Jordan, because 242 contemplated complete recognition by all the Arab countries as a condition to the return of any land. Now, even when the Arab states fully and completely comply with their obligations under 242, which I emphasize has not occurred, there still is no obligation on the part of Israel under 242 to return all the lands. And this is the part of the resolution that I was involved in, and that my advice was sought on, and that I overheard and participated as a silent person in conversations. And that is the debate over whether the resolution would contain the words, as the Russians wanted them to, the Soviets wanted them to, all territories, or as the French wanted them to, the territories, using the definite article in French. And Justice Goldberg, Ambassador Goldberg, and Lord Carradine and the United States firmly rejected that interpretation and the inclusion of those words. Indeed, after an agreement was reached that the word all or the word the would not be included, some member states of the United Nations said, well, we're going to interpret it to include the words the or the words all, and British Ambassador Lord Carradine firmly declared after the vote, it is only the resolution that will bind us, and we regard its wording as clear. And when he was asked to explain the position later, Lord Carradine was as clear as it could be. Quote, it would have been wrong to demand that Israel return to its position of June 4th, 1967, because those positions were undesirable and artificial. You'll recall the famous phrase that Avi Ibn used. He described the 1949 lines as the Auschwitz lines, the lines that left Israel vulnerable to the attacks that precipitated the war of 1967. Arthur Goldberg was very, very clear as well. He said the notable omissions, which were not accidental in regard to withdrawal, are the words the or all and the words June 5th, 1967 line. The resolution speaks of withdrawal from occupied territories without defining the extent of the withdrawal. In other words, the extent of the withdrawal would be subject to negotiation, and the contemplation was that Israel would not return to the 1949 or pre-1967 war lines. It was contemplated that Israel would maintain control over those areas, unpopulated areas, areas that did not require necessarily an occupation of people, but those areas that were essential to its defense. Indeed, the Alone Plan was specifically, or a variation of the Alone Plan, was specifically contemplated at the time these resolutions were being enacted. A plan under which military control of essential areas would be maintained. I remember specifically a discussion of the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the latrine area, and everybody acknowledged that it would be impossible for Israel to go back to the pre-1967 days when the high areas were controlled by Arab gunmen and when Jerusalem was divided so that people who lived in various parts of the city had to have barriers on their windows to prevent snipers from shooting them. There was no contemplation whatsoever by the drafters of the UN Resolution 242 that there would be a return to those lands. And so we've seen a lot of rewriting of history. We see a lot of rewriting by American academics, by European academics. We see rewriting by Arab diplomats. One of the reasons that the Arab countries wouldn't accept 242, obviously the major reason was they wouldn't accept any boundaries, they wouldn't accept Israel's legitimacy, but they certainly wouldn't accept and didn't accept Israel's maintaining of some areas that were within their control after the war. But that was what the UN resolution contemplated. Again, recalling the fact that it was virtually unprecedented to ask somebody in Israel's position to return any land. The decision was made to allow it to hold on to some lands that would be required for its safety and security. Now, this doesn't deal with the issue of civilian settlements. It doesn't deal with the issue of control over population centers. There was simply no discussion of that. Remember that UN Resolution 242 had nothing to do with the Palestinians. It made a reference to a just resolution of the refugee issue, but the Palestinians were not regarded as a party to the resolution. They didn't have to do anything. Nothing was expected of them, although it was expected, obviously, that they wouldn't oppose or create barriers to the Arab states accepting the resolution. But this was a state-state resolution. It bound Israel as a state, and it bound the Arab nations as a state. Jordan, Egypt, Syria, the other Arab nations. And when the Arab nations finally all agree to accept Resolution 242 and make peace with Israel, Israel will be obliged to do what it did in the Gaza, not as much as what it did in Gaza, because there was a return of all the land, and do that in the West Bank. But when it does it, it will not be obliged, at least not under 242, to return all the territories. It will be obliged to return territories, the extent of which will be subject to negotiation and will depend on the nature of the peace achieved. Those are my clear recollections. I would be delighted to share those recollections with any court or file an affidavit to memorialize those recollections. But there is absolutely no doubt of two facts, and here I'll end. Fact number one, Israel was required to give up not an inch of land until it received in return recognition, the right to exist within peaceful and secure boundaries, and that when that occurred, it was not obliged under 242 to give up all the territories or the territories, only territories, and it was contemplated that they would not give up territories essential to their military defense, and they would not return to the border that led to such a potential disaster and catastrophic war. So those are my memories. I'm happy to take the questions. I'm happy to have further conversation. But I was asked here today to recall my memories. I'm very clear about those memories, and I'm happy and privileged and honored to share them with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dershowitz. One would have liked to hear more from you and more often. These things are very important. Dori, from a purely technical point of view, can we have questions and answers? Yeah, so that means people will have to come up here, or do we have microphones in the hall? Okay, speak from the table and I'll... Okay, are you still ready to take some questions, Alan?
I'm anxious to take some questions.
Okay.
I'm used to being a lawyer. I'm not used to being a witness, but I'm appearing here today as a witness subject to cross-examination.
Okay, so look, let's do it like they do in the States. Form a line and come up to the microphone here. if anybody wants to ask a question, please. Ken. Okay. State your name, please, when you put the question to Professor Dershowitz.
Professor Dershowitz, I'm Toby Willig, and I'm glad to at least speak to you this way. I would like to ask, from a purely legal point of view, then since the Palestinians never entered into the picture of 242, how come we are now negotiating with the Palestinians, and the world expects us to negotiate with the Palestinians, and this is the big issue when basically 242 says, as you stated very clearly, it had to do with these states, with Arab states. Have we lost any moral ground? Have we lost legal reasoning by doing this?
Here's the legal analysis that at least is presented. That is, the Jordanian government was occupying the West Bank. The Jordanian government made a decision subsequent to 1967 to turn its authority over West Bank lands over to the Palestinian Authority, and so the Palestinian Authority, I guess, claims under 242 the right to serve as a surrogate to the Jordanian government with the permission of the Jordanian government. Now, these are, highly technical legal analyses, but the law doesn't generally control what happens in these areas. The Palestinian Authority now is the authority that has the accepted legitimacy around the world to speak for the Palestinian people. That wasn't true during the unknown, what I always call the unknown occupations. The world doesn't remember that the West Bank was occupied between 1948 and 1967, and the Gaza brutally occupied by Egypt during that same period of time. When you hear about the occupation, it only means the Israeli occupation. But the reality is that the world today accepts the Palestinian Authority, or the Palestinian government, or however one wants to call the Palestinians today with their divided government with Hamas and Fatah, as the authoritative representatives of the people. And matters have changed. Things have changed. The law reflects changing realities. And the Israelis have to negotiate with the Palestinians. And the idea that was proposed back in the early 70s and late 60s, that perhaps there would be a federation and Jordan would control the Palestinian state, is no longer viable. The Jordanians don't want that, the Palestinians don't want it, and the Israelis have been prepared to negotiate with the Palestinians. Indeed, they did in 2000, 2001, and came awfully close to achieving a peace. And had that peace been achieved, we would today be celebrating, the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th anniversary of a two-state solution. So that's the reality.
And from the point of view of legality, when Yasser Arafat supposedly recognized the state of Israel, was that a legal acceptance?
Well, legality is often a matter of perception. Certainly it was a pragmatic acceptance, but it does not click in 242, because 242 requires not only verbal recognition of Israel's right to exist, but agreed upon boundaries, secure boundaries, etc. So Arafat's statements, inconsistent as they were at the time, do not require Israel, simply as a result of that, under 242, to do anything. More is required of the Palestinians or the Arab states under 242.
My name is Richter, Hebrew University, Hadassah School of Medicine. This morning, Amnesty International announced that the barrier, the fence, the wall, whatever it is called, was a violation of human rights because it was sitting on occupied territory. The question, their statement really raises the question of the juxtaposition of human rights and international law. And also, could you comment on what set of human rights we're dealing with here? Right to life, right to territory, and so on.
Well, it all is related. If Israel is the legitimate occupying authority, as Eugene Rostow quite clearly said it was, until such time as 242 is completed, then it is entitled to build security apparatus to protect its population and protect its troops. The United States is building barriers in Iraq, in Afghanistan. The Chinese have built many, many dozens of barriers in Tibet. The issue is singling out Israel and Israel's security barrier. There are two decisions on it, one not binding on Israel because it was done by the International Court of Justice, which is the United Nations Court, and which in reality does not allow Israeli